But hey, I'm sitting here with Dom Phipps. Dom and I talked, I don't know, what was it, about a year ago, year and a half ago?
Yeah, maybe like 18 months ago. Yeah.
Yeah. About, well, you give him a little...
Yeah, sure.
The book you did.
Well, firstly, it's great to be back.
Oh, yeah. My glamorous house.
Different venue this time than the bank parking lot, which is great. Yeah, so we talked about the project, the birth of the freestyle movement, which was a book I was working on. A book that's going to, or did, kind of record some of the kind of essential parts of the BMX freestyle scene in the 1980s. So we kind of got through that project, and it was a busy one. Several other different elements to it that helped us to, well, enabled us to put the book together.
Yeah.
Books are very difficult to do in that they're very laborious projects. There's a lot of work involved, particularly when you're, you know, just a small team of people doing it. In this case, it was myself and Xavier. So Xavier Mendez. He was taking care of a lot of the operational stuff. I was pretty much drilled into the creative side on the book, doing the interviewing, traveling, bringing the community of people together. So it was very busy, and you know, we did our very best. We you know, had a couple of hiccups, but essentially we launched the book last summer at the Baz US Open in the US. Yeah,
and you know, I think people that listen to this podcast and know me know that, you know, I'm kind of a big history buff when it comes to you know, BMX and BMX freestyle. I mean, that's kind of why I started the podcast. And you know, so when I heard you wanted to do a second edition and kind of basically cram more stuff into the book, I was really excited about it, and I thought it'd be fun to just have you back on and talk about what's going into that, because, you know, the more people know about where BMX came from, I think the more positive it can move forward, you know. So yeah, so what's going on you got a second edition you're working on?
Yeah, so basically, I want to say like 3 months ago, I was selling books occasionally, you know, on the website. And I had a couple of boxes in my garage, and and you know, I kind of one day I went out there and I pulled a book out to put it into packaging, and I was thinking, you know, what is my ambition now for the project? Because essentially, you know, it concludes when you've got no books to sell. And
you're running a little low.
Yeah, it's kind of getting to the end of it, and we had some books going to distribution as well. So you know, we printed a certain amount. Some were sold directly, some were sold at book launches. A lot were pre-sold, which was great. And that, again, yes, it's sort of testament really to the passion of the BMX community out there, that they recognised that we needed that help to kind of pre-fund it. So anyway, I just started thinking about what should I do with it. You know, should I just reprint it, put it back out? So I ended up putting a copy of it next to my bed, and with a bunch of post-it notes. And really just kind of went through it in the evening, occasionally, and just made notes on it, thinking, you know, if I was going to, when we send it back to print, what needs to be done?
Yeah.
And it went really from a point of me thinking, you know, I'll just kind of tidy it up and maybe change out some imagery, retouch some imagery, to being something much more comprehensive, I guess. And me recognizing, after speaking to some different people, that there really were some sort of more essential elements that could go into it, to make it a more, you know, more kind of finished piece.
Yeah.
So I then started a plan, you know, the last couple of months of thinking, what would I put in it, who would contribute, you know, what is the end result of the reprint, and that's kind of where I'm at. So we've got a lot of new content.
Yeah. What's some of the content you felt like you were, like, you know, when you were looking at the book and you're sitting there, I mean, you know, you could go on and on, but what were some of the key contents or the key pieces or the cogs to the puzzle that you thought you were missing?
Well, the first thing really is that, you know you can't put everything in.
Yeah.
And you know you shouldn't, because, you know, no disrespect to anybody out there, but the book has to be a finished piece at some point. And also, I guess I have to make the decisions after research what is essential to it. There were two things that I had in my mind, and the first one was, I did have an idea that in the first book we'd put a chapter about the curb dogs, in. So the NorCal crew, legendary, you know.
Yeah, I mean, if you're not familiar with the Curb Dogs, there's like Drob, Dave Vanderspec. I don't know.
There was a core group. They
kind of came out of Golden Gate. And
yeah, that's right. There was a scene there that the Curb Dogs kind of emerged out of, and they had some, you know, some pretty sort of solid characters and leaders, people like Dave Vanderspec, who kind of galvanized a bit of a scene. Yeah,
I mean, Dave was definitely a pivotal dude. I mean, that scene was coming up at the same time, like, wouldn't you say, like, Buff and RL and all those dudes were kind of coming up?
Yeah, definitely.
In the early 80s. I mean, but it just wasn't seen as much.
Well, it wasn't, and that's another reason that I wanted to revisit, because you know, there are certain people out there that would say, you know, the media center for BMX freestyle was down in LA, and of course, fair enough, and the media in BMX freestyle did an incredible job of promoting, you know, the scene, the sport, and getting more kids into it, and developing it into this really cool kind of culture.
Yeah.
So when I spoke to Maurice, who's, you know, Maurice is such a typically modest and helpful guy.
Yeah.
I said to him, listen, you know, I'm going to do another edition, and I'm thinking about maybe putting the Curb Dogs chapter in. Would you help me with it? And in a very, you know, modest, kind way as usual, he said to me, Dom, to be honest with you, I would suggest you look at the bigger picture of the Northern Californian scene, because as much as I'd love to be, you know, we'd love to be the beacon for that scene, there was a much bigger scene here with more elements to it, and I think there's a NorCal story, not just a Curb Dog story.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, yeah, NorCal's, I mean, it's always had a rich history, but even at that time, I mean, Wilkerson, you know, we already went over Maurice and Vanderspec. I mean, towards the tail end, Mike Kernike, Hugo Gonzalez.
Yeah.
You know, there was a lot of dudes. Rick Allison.
Yeah, there was a really strong group of talent up there, and you know, there were different pieces to the jigsaw too. So there was the Curb Dogs, and you know, a lot of people don't know that, you know, there were half-pipe contests up there.
Yeah,
back in the early 80s.
Joe Lopes ramp.
On Joe Lopes ramp, yeah, there was a couple of contests where skaters and BMXers were riding against each other, or not against each other, but in the same arena.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of innovation, and you know, as usual, skateboarding is kind of looming in the background of freestyle as an influence to it, and that's something that I think I've found is prevalent right through the decade. So there were a ton of things happening. There was a great street riding scene. There was a really strong community of riders that would you know, form up and ride together at the Golden Gate Park, for instance.
Yeah.
And again, I know a little bit about that, but when I sort of dipped into it a little bit further, talking to guys like Robert Peterson and Maurice, and we've got, I want to say, another 15 guys that are going to contribute out of that scene. It really, you know, gave me a sense of how important that was. And community is a good word for it, because they were very welcoming of new riders. They were, you know, it was very much a jam format. It was an early kind of place that riders got together and just rode.
Yeah, and you see the photos, and it does look like early jam format, like, you know, back in the day, like big jam circle, you know, and it looks like there's like, you see some of those photos, and it looks like they're from like, I mean, I'm just guessing, like 84, 83, and it looks like there's 100 riders at that time up there.
Yeah, totally. It was like the lightning rod for anybody in that scene, and word traveled quickly because those guys were so passionate about what they were doing. And you know, it's a bunch of kids wearing jeans and t-shirts and riding goofy bikes with 2 different colour wheels on them, and there's roller skaters, you know, rolling alongside bike riders filming them. So it's a really interesting and very cultural scene that's early on in the story.
It's kind of, I mean, it's kind of reflective of San Francisco and Northern California as itself, you know?
You've nailed it, because that really is, you know, the way I feel about it, and with my limited knowledge of different cultures in this country, having, you know, moved here as an Englishman. Yeah. I certainly recognise that there's a different kind of flavour to their scene than there is from the Southern Californian guys and the LA guys. Yeah. And, you know, again, I go back to it, I think it's an essential part of the story. We're going to allow a fairly chunky sized chapter, I think up to about 40 pages, to cover that scene. Yeah. Got incredible imagery, as always. You know, I'm a big proponent for getting good quality and imagery, stuff that hasn't been seen, stuff that's, you know, demonstrating something. illustrating something cool. So we've got a lot of that and a lot of willing guys who are moving the needle up there, who we're going to contribute to. So I'm excited about that chapter.
Awesome. What are there? I mean, there's even more chapters than just the NorCal Curb Dogs one. What are some of the other ones?
The other kind of main one that towards the end of the last project we were, I sort of put that book together chronologically, meaning I started at the start and finished at the end.
Yeah.
The last chapter, the last kind of main history chapter was no permit required, which was all about street BMX.
Yeah.
And
the rise of it in the late 80s and stuff.
Exactly. And one of the things I really wanted to illustrate in that chapter that I'm not sure I successfully did in the end was to show really that this kind of street riding culture was prevalent right through. People tend to sort of put a date on it and say, oh, the street era was, 88 when Ron started to put on contests. But one thing that's consistent all the way through, all the people I spoke to, from John Swanigan and Bob Haro and Mike Buff and R.L. Osborne, was that these guys, riding their bike on the street, that was Brian Scurra.
Oh, that's fine.
Riding their bikes on the street was the constant thing.
Yeah.
So what I started to do at the end of the chapter was I started talking to people like Vic Murphy and Pete Augustin, and the more I spoke to those guys, the more I became aware of. Excuse me. Brian, can I call you back? I've just started doing a podcast.
Okay, yeah, call me back.
Okay, will do, thanks.
Okay, bye.
Here, you want to silence it?
Yeah, I better do.
If you didn't know, that was Brian Scurra calling him. Probably talk about the project, so...
Yeah, that's it. Let's just turn that down. Anyway, sorry. So, yeah, I started talking to those guys at length, and, I became pretty educated, I guess, about... their scene, their beliefs, their motivation.
Yeah, that San Diego scene.
And again, it's another little epicenter in the story that is quite unknown. And they had their own culture, different to the NorCal guys, different to the LA guys, different to what was emerging in the other side of the country.
And kind of the leaders of the Dirt Bros. I think that whole crew and that San Diego crew, it was pretty broad, but I mean it was Brad Blanchard, Vic Murphy, Ronnie Farmer,
That's it.
Pete August, Carla Wick.
Jimmy Arrington was part of the mix.
Yeah.
Eddie Roman was kind of around it too.
Yeah.
Eddie was like a kind of, I don't even know the best way to describe it, but Eddie was in the mix. And
Volker would dip his toe in the pool.
Exactly. Volker was never far away either. And those guys had a lifestyle and they had a belief system, and they left a legacy.
Yeah.
Because when we think about,
both of those scenes, what they did is still felt today,
They're almost the connection, between what's happening now and what was happening then.
Yeah.
And, without making it sound, too critical like that, there's certainly elements of what they did and the way they thought about things and the way they wanted to ride. They were a little bit counterculture. They weren't particularly motivated by, getting paid or anything. They were just, we're just going to exercise our liberty to ride and do the stuff we want to do and innovate. So they didn't really have any kind of grand master plan, but they were a solid crew. They were like-minded. They, were almost kind of telepathic from what I can tell. And they put together something that, again, is an essential piece that needs to be in the project.
Yeah, there's some imagery and some story. I know some of the stories, and there's some stories.
Yeah,
that are pretty amazing.
I get excited about this stuff.
Yeah,
I'm a fan of this story. I see myself as the lightning rod to put the story out. But in the same way, anyone picks a book up doesn't know these stories. That's I get that excitement too when I go and interview people. So that is one I'm particularly motivated to get down. So.
Are we missing any chapters?
The other thing I'm definitely looking to do is to dig in a little bit to the dirt scene as that emerged.
Yeah.
Because BMX Action magazine was a bit of a proponent of what was happening in the racing scene, obviously, with freestyling and Go being dedicated very much to freestyle. BMX Action maintained its course with BMX racing.
Yeah.
And one of the things that was happening at races was something that was very similar to what was happening at the beginning of the decade, which was that there'd be halftime intervals at BMX races while they, tally up the moto sheets and get organised for the next round of motos. And just like they did in the early days when Haro and RL and Bath and those guys would put on shows, there was a dirt jumping scene coming out of that place too. So there was a community of guys that were, I guess, coming out of racing and exercising a new direction, which was all about dirt jumping, which of course is now a huge kind of piece of the whole BMX story.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to get into that too, and I have some conversations going on with a few of those guys, and also with a couple of people in the media that were helping to sort of orchestrate that and give it presence through magazines. So I'll update a little bit more on that further down the line, but I'm excited about that too. I think that's a really cool, leaf on the vine.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And are you going to be talking to any like new riders, that are just kind of like kind of last time you just missed the mark with them? Any?
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the things I was aware of listening back to some of the audio from the interviews, and it kind of has to be like this: is you talk to people about very specific things.
Yeah.
So
like if you go into the project, you're like, hey, here's RL. I want to talk to you about the BMX Action Trick Team. Certain staple things.
In the most boring form ever, there's a spreadsheet that exists with chapters and contributors called out.
Yeah.
And it has to be like that again, because otherwise, you've got no kind of direction. But it was quite aware, I became quite aware, shall I say, that when I started listening back to some of the audio a month or two ago, that there were certain riders that, had I had turned the tables and said to them, what should we be talking about in terms of your story, that probably they would have talked about something different.
Yeah.
So that's not to say that talking to RL about the BMX Action Trick Team isn't highly relevant. Of course it is.
Yeah. And
that's not to say talking to Eddie Roman about the AFA isn't highly relevant, because it is. But certainly there's some expansion, on those stories. RL was one of the longest campaigners in that era. He came in right at the front end, and he went out right at the back end of it. If we call it, an era, I guess.
Yeah.
So I'm looking to try and I've reviewed some of the chapters to see where we can bring, different voices in. And what we're going to end up with actually is a book that has an enormous amount of updates to it.
Yeah.
And again, I defend the fact that the book is the book, the first edition. I think it's a good piece of work. But giving myself an opportunity to go back to it now and say, okay, what do we do to improve it? I can just push it out into the world again and print it. Or I can be, re-engage my fanboy personality, and we can actually make it better and better. Because one thing is certain, that there was a 10-year era that probably has 20 years of content in it.
So, well, and it's just crazy how fast stuff moves. When we were watching some footage last night, and we saw a Haro show in '88 with Wilkerson, Blyther, and Nori. And at the end of the show, Wilkerson does a nothing air, like pretty much like it's nothing. I mean, like it's nothing.
Yeah.
And it was a pretty intense show. And then we looked at a show. We just clicked on the next thing, looked at a show. It was 4 years earlier, and it was who was it? Wilkerson and
Ron and Rich Avella.
Yeah, and Rich Avella, and they're riding a 6 foot tall, 6 foot wide quarter, doing like 2 foot tables out of it, and it's almost comedic.
Yeah.
The ramp's shaking. I think they had it pushed up against a car or something. And it just, that 4 years, and they're just wearing full jerseys, goggles. And in that 4 years time, it literally seems like there's like, it feels like it's like 2 decades between them. Like how fast it moved.
Absolutely. And I think that, again, that's something to try and illustrate in the book, is this kind of really steep curve of evolution that wasn't, and you can talk about it as a whole evolving, but the riders were evolving the riding, the media were evolving the culture, the photographers were playing their part in capturing the action and being able to put it out into global distribution. So there's all these different elements, but you called it out when we watched it last night. Over a 4 year period, these are almost 2 completely different scenarios.
I mean, it's like comparing the 80s to the 50s when you looked at it. It was insane.
Absolutely. And the one from '84 with Ron and Rich, looking completely drilled in GT uniforms and having a that kind of the time person identity.
Yeah.
And then, as you say, 4 years later, these guys have kind of grown up. They've become more independent, and they look like teenagers or kids at 16, 17 years old that are exercising that their independence, I guess. And the level of tricks is just staggering. I mean, and actually, folks, Shad has convinced me to allow us to publish that Nothing Air on the Snakebite website. So you'll be able to see that later.
Yeah, we'll post that video up. So, another. Well, let's use this as a precursor to roll in, because we were going to talk about Action Now, the magazine, a little.
Yeah.
But we were talking a little about Jeff Watson last night, and you told me kind of a funny story that I got excited about, and I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, as my geekness is quite centered on that really early skate park era.
Yeah.
So I tend to selfishly put a lot of time and effort into researching that.
Yeah, that like 78 to 82.
Yeah, so there's certainly the turn of the 70s and 80s. I mean, I'd say 80, 81. There were these guys out there that even the guys that we talk to speak about. So
yeah, where the Eddie Fiolos and the Dominguezes.
Yeah,
there was a crew. There were dudes before them.
There were these people that in some ways were inspiring them.
Yeah,
and they were almost kind of like mythical names. I mean, one of the things I did when I speak to Eddie and Mike and some of the guys, even Fred Becker from that early era around Whittier and the kind of beach city skate parks. They talk about Jeff Watson, and everyone has a consistent kind of message about him, which was that he was this kid they'd heard of, and he was doing these radical things, and it was kind of what's the right word? It was an inspiration to those guys.
Yeah,
the beginning of airing out of pools and landing to flat. We've seen pictures of Woody Itson doing that at the Big O. Certainly Mike Dominguez and Martin Aparicio and people like that have spoken about that too, and said that was the first thing that people were doing. Whether Jeff was the first guy to be airing back in again, I don't know, but I know that there was this scene at the Colton Skate Park, and the Colton Skate Park was well known really because it was a bit of a stronghold for the Veriflex skateboard team that were very proactive in that era.
Which they were a notorious skate scene. I mean, skate team and kind of crew.
Yeah.
In the late 70s.
I think Losey's mother was the one that was running it. Alan Losey's mother.
Oh, the truth is Mark Losey. I was like, what?
And I think so the story goes, and I'll keep it short because it is actually in the book too.
Yeah. We don't want to take too much away, but I thought it'd be a fun little.
Matt Rawdon was the owner of Moose BMX,
which was a BMX shop.
It was a BMX shop in Riverside, and it was the one that Jeff would come and work out part-time, and Ted Emma was also part of that crew.
Yeah.
Jeff was also someone that hung out with a lot of the skaters too, so he, it wasn't a kind of them and us thing to that degree, but Colton certainly weren't, the skate park, Rancho Mediterranea, they weren't really motivated to let bike riders in, like a lot of the parks weren't. They didn't need to, I guess, at that point.
Yeah, because it was still riding high.
Yeah, but Matt Rawdon, who is a really, really cool guy, who I'm in touch with quite regularly, who owned Moose BMX, he was the guy really that was the catalyst to get Jeff some permission to ride. And that kind of accumulated into a point where there was a skate competition there. I want to say late 80, maybe early 81. I need to probably clarify that. But and it was Matt really that kind of got them convinced to allow bikes to come into that contest.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a kind of vertical contest. It was more a kind of slalom style thing at that point. I believe that Bob Haro was a judge at that contest. And it was one of the first that we know of. I think it predates the King of the Skate Park, Lakewood anyway. And again, a little bit of an incubator in the middle of nowhere for a scene that's kind of erupting. So there'll be more about Jeff Watson in this book, and I think I've got some more photography coming of him actually at the Pipeline of all places, which is pretty exciting. Yeah,
no, he's definitely an icon, and someone who for years I feel like was lost in the mix.
Yeah, I mean he was, the mention of his name would always make people kind of very respectful and excited. really there wasn't too much more known, and Jeff's no longer with us, unfortunately. But on the last project, researching, deciding to go down that rabbit hole and find out more about it, bumping into people, speaking to his family, finding Matt Rawdon, Ted Emma, those guys, it was worth the effort, I think. Definitely.
Yeah. Well, and you look at, his Action Now cover, Action Now was like, it was a magazine that covered BMX and pretty much whatever you want to term an action sports back then, like late 70s, early 80s. Did it come out in the 70s or was it just started in 80s?
Essentially Action Now was Skateboarder magazine, and the editorial team at Skateboarder was part of Surfer Publications, which was obviously a bigger publishing group. And Skateboarder, as all things tend to do, vertical skateboarding was on the rocks. It was dropping in popularity for all these different reasons that we know about. And actually, the Action Now team were given an opportunity to sort of reinvent it. So they created a new idea called Action Now. So from Skateboarder, it became Skateboarders Action Now.
Yeah.
And then it just became Action Now like 2 months later. So they transitioned it. And the team there was James Casimus, and James had been the staff photographer at Skateboarder while he was still in high school. So that speaks to his talent.
And he shot some iconic skate photos.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no higher credit you can give James Casimus. He's a great guy and a great photographer. And Dean Bradley was there. So Dean had done some work with BMX Action magazine. So Dean was shooting and he was doing editorial. D. David Morin was the editor. And what these guys had decided to do was to diversify the content of the magazine to be taking in all these other things that were emerging. So at the time, I think there was some GPV going on. Gravity powered vehicles.
Yep.
There was obviously mountain biking was coming through. Surfing was clearly there. There was sandboarding. I think they might have covered a bit of snow.
I think they did early snow. They did motocross.
They did motocross. You're right. Yeah. And they also brought some sort of music, some punk rock music into it. So they recognised this lifestyle opportunity, and they were turning the magazine in that direction. And what happened around about that time was Bob Haro had left BMX Action magazine, and he'd become friendly, I think, with some of the guys at Action Now, particularly Dean, and he kind of came into their field of view. And I give Action Now a lot of credit, and deservedly so, and those guys, because I think what they did is they took everything they'd learned in skateboarding, everything they'd learned about skateboarding kids, and what motivated them, and what language they spoke, and the lifestyle they led. And they recognised that Bob Haro was doing something like that on a bike. So between them all, I guess, they worked it out, and they figured out how to kind of crystallise what freestyle was.
Yeah, I feel that stuff that was going on in Southern California from probably, that whole lifestyle of how kids lived in Southern California from like the late 60s till then, it kind of was finally, they were wrangling it all up and trying to capture it. Because, Southern California people have always been riding motocross. They were skating, they were surfing, they were riding their bikes to the skate spot, to the surf spot, then jumping their bikes at the same time, and then, out of those you were getting mountain biking and snowboarding, and, the punk scene was going crazy at the time, and it kind of just pulled all that into one bubble.
It was really like a melting pot of all these different cultures. And these things, I think, were really, really kind of centric to Southern California. And they still are.
Yes.
The action sport lifestyle here is one that's embraced, isn't it? All right, we're in Oregon saying this, but...
Yeah, that's just, it's a, that's kind of a face of Southern California.
Yeah.
It's like good weather all year round, you can go play,
Exactly, and you can indulge all these different things. And, of course, kids, as you said, kids always have done that.
Yeah.
And at a certain point, I think the skateboarding blueprint, without giving it too much credit, was the thing that, when you took BMX racing and you took skateboarding and you put this thing in the middle of them, it's kind of like, the child of the two parents. BMX racing kind of enabled the equipment side of it, the hardware side of it. A BMX bike was capable of doing more than just racing on, and of course, I guess skateboarding culture to some degree inspired a lot of the tricks and the riding and the early skate park experimentation we see. So I definitely want to get to grips a little bit more with that piece of it.
Yeah, and then you can always, but then you can always go back before that too and be, when people just first started skating pools and they'd ride their bike there and ride their bike in the pool, it all came, it's like a two-headed dragon that came from, same body. It all came from the same spot and it's just, grown apart and grown together and intertwined, through the years.
It's motivations, it's the right people involved, it's circumstances, the drought that happened in Southern California.
In the 70s.
Up all these, far-reaching drainage ditches to ride, and kids didn't want to skate there, so they rode their bikes.
Yeah.
And then there's a bike on the scene, and that's when that kind of connection started to get made, I think.
Yeah, because, the ditches during that drought, all the pools are empty, but all the ditches are empty. And the ditches were too nasty to probably ride with clay wheels and stuff back then.
Exactly.
So you'd be riding your bike in it, and then you go to ride your bike to a pool later and skate the pool. Oh, I could take my bike in here and mess around, It's like...
Yeah. There's even stories about the when LA Airport expanded its runway. I'm not sure when that was, but certainly apparently they bought up a bunch of real estate that was in the way.
Yeah.
And all of those houses had swimming pools. So there was this huge, huge, expansive neighborhood that was completely empty, had nobody in it, and tons of empty swimming pools. So
it turned into like an early skate park.
There you go. And I think there were a bunch of skateboarders and maybe some bike riders that went and made use of that. So there's all these little subplots that come together, and I get interested in that stuff. So I tend to sort of to indulge.
Well, it's just funny how little click like that, like the LA airport can have such a big influence on a different type of subculture or something.
Well, because guess what? If one kid is introduced to skating or riding a bike at that point, and that kid goes on to do something different, maybe it's a maybe it's a kind of Ron Wilson type guy, or maybe Tony Hawk or a Gator Rogowski or a Kevin Starr or somebody that goes there and gets that connection. Not saying it was those guys, but it only takes one pivotal person, as we know, in our world to lead it, and to lead it somewhere new.
And to pull more people into the mix.
Exactly.
It can take the way one person looks at BMX and the way he goes about it and goes at it, he can influence and bring in hundreds to thousands more. I mean, look at Hoffman. How many people do you think ride because of Hoffman?
I mean, you couldn't quantify it, could you?
Yeah,
it's huge. Yeah.
So, and that's just one person.
Yeah.
And then whoever inspired him is the catalyst for that, and it can go on and on and on down.
I think it's even happening now. I mean, I watched some of the Vans Pro Cup.
Yeah, the Vans Pro Cup's up.
There's a bunch of kids there that are leaders. They're Dennis Emerson's a phenomenal rider. Larry Edgar, the high air contest every year is just outrageous. So it's still happening now, I think.
Yeah. So with you adding stuff to the book, and it's a second edition, but in a way, it's almost like like a 1.5. It seems like you're adding a whole another half a book. Is it going to be laid out the same? How are you just like tacking stuff on at the end, or how are you kind of going about it?
Well, basically what's happening is I'm retooling it completely. I'm not changing it for the sake of changing it. There's a ton of content that doesn't need any changes to it. What I am going to do in every chapter is introduce a little bit of an intro. Introduce an intro. So give some backstory. I was very keen to make sure the first one was this kind of pure oral history piece where it doesn't need a bunch of documentary style narrative in it.
Yeah.
So I did that, and you turn the first page of every chapter and you're hearing from a writer or a pivotal person. I do think that I need to introduce some of that now. So I've looked at it, and I'll just write some brief passages just to make sure people have a bit more kind of context on what's happening. Certainly a lot of that does come out in the chapters, but I think it's a good thing. While we have some space to do it, is to add a little intro just to give people a backstory, what's happening, why they're about to read what they're about to read. So there's going to be intros in every chapter, so that's 9 chapters with extra content. But another thing too, there'll be extra content in some of those chapters, so targeted content. I'm very interested.
Some more photos and
Yeah, I mean, imagery is always, is exciting.
Yeah.
And like I said, I always try and find stuff that hasn't been used before, hasn't been seen, and is good quality. But I'm interested in a couple of things, like, I want to get into that. I want to get into it with Ron Wilkerson about that trifecta weekend where he put together, the first King of Dirt.
At Mission Hills.
Yeah, the Mission Hills King of Dirt.
You should get into the Dirt Bros about that one too.
Yeah, there might be some crossover there. I'm sure Vic might want to have something to say.
And yeah, it was what was that, 90, 91?
Yeah, there was a La Jolla Meet the Street. There was a King of Dirt
at Mission Hills, and then he had a vert contest at his house,
Lemon Grove house,
and it kind of turned into, because I've talked to Eben about it. It was kind of when BMX was dead, and there wasn't enough real pros there, so it kind of turned into a vert jam.
Yeah,
it
was very indicative of what was going on at the time,
because it really felt like it was like Eben, Jay Miron,
yeah,
Blyther,
then Hoffman was riding,
Wilkerson, and Hoffman.
Yeah,
so
yeah, and Ron is an ambitious guy, as we know. And he did some incredible stuff. He's moved the needle, as we like to say. And knowing Ron, he likes to take everything to the limit, which is his kind of personality. So I'm just quite interested in his memories of that, and I guess it's no major mystery what his motivation was, because Ron is that kind of guy. But I'd like to know more from him about that.
Yeah.
So we'll get into a bit more of the Two Hip King of Vert series, and we'll also be bringing Dino De Luca into that chapter. So Dino was a phenomenal rider, a GT rider, primarily a vert rider.
Yeah, I would say, though, towards the later years, I would say he was a street rider, but I'd almost say he was an early, mini, he rode, I think he rode mini ramp, and he rode pretty good at all those early street contests,
Yeah, I think he was a good bike rider, wasn't he? So he could certainly adapt to anything, I think.
Yeah.
Personally, I love looking at pictures of the rubber band airs and just how stylish he was. And
Dino's kind of one of those riders that, as much as he was in the spotlight and kind of a pretty big pro there, from 88 to 91, you don't. Just like a lot of dudes, you don't really know much about him.
You don't, and one thing we do know about him, and I'm sure he would admit to this too, is that he was a little bit bit controversial at times, and certainly an extreme personality. So
yeah,
I'm very keen to hear more about him.
I've heard he's pushed people's buttons and stuff.
Yeah, totally. And I'd like to, I've heard from the people that have had their buttons pushed, and I'm interested to hear it from the button pusher.
Yeah, because there's always two sides of the story, and
of course, and you know what? None of it is it's criminal behaviour. It's just dynamics, and these things, these personalities and these attitudes, good, bad, or indifferent, are just all part of the kind of rich tapestry of the scene.
Yeah,
and they're needed, aren't they? So we're going to hear from Dino. And a lot of the other chapters will have additional narrative and additional images. And again, the reason for that actually is I've taken the grip off the page count a little bit. So this book will be, the original book was 244 pages.
Yeah.
This book is going to be 310. So
okay.
It's going to be really big.
Yeah.
Another thing that we're doing, which is something that I'm personally quite keen on, is telling the industry story again. When I think about the components of the scene, we know about the riders and we love that story. We know about the media, the journalists and the photographers and how they told the story.
Yeah, the storytellers.
Yeah. But the industry had a role too.
Yeah, it supplied the money and the plane tickets and the
exactly.
and the style.
Exactly. It was a critical part of it. And, again, as a kid, my role in this is really, I was a kid on 7,000 miles away in a little suburban neighbourhood in England. My interpretation of it all was through magazines and occasionally seeing the show and riding with my buddies and stuff. So often for us it was like, God, how do I get a better bike? How do I get that new pair of handlebars? How do I learn that trick in the magazine? So the industry side of it, I think, for people that aren't in the industry is quite important and quite interesting. So what I've tried to do on this particular book is look at another set of brands. What are these new brand stories we can tell?
So with the old book, the brands you touched on and did history was...
so we had Vans,
Oakley,
yeah, GT, Haro, SE, and Skyway.
Okay. Which are all iconic brands.
All very iconic and very supportive of the early scene. I mean, we wouldn't have got to the middle of the decade without those brands, I don't think. Yeah. In terms of what they brought to it. But also, they all predated, trick riding or freestyle. I mean, Oakley, was been around since the late 70s. Yeah. Vans have been around since the mid 60s. We know that. Haro, is regarded largely as a freestyle brand, but
yeah, kind of it was the first freestyle brand.
But certainly Bob was proactive in BMX racing before there was a freestyler to indulge. GT2, very strong in BMX racing. So when I looked at this, I thought, okay, who are the brands that we can zero in on that are relevant, because this isn't open to anybody. You have to be part of an exclusive little industry community, I guess, to be in. Yeah. So we're not going to talk about energy drink companies or anything like that. So I started looking at the back end of the decade, and we have Vision. So we'll be talking about Vision's impact on the...
Which you couldn't, I mean, from like 87 on, you couldn't open a BMX magazine without seeing somebody decked out with Vision, everything.
Exactly. And it's a really interesting story because, Vision was obviously a skateboard company originally, and they'd learned a lot to get where they got to. And they become massive. And actually they came into the scene, I think, and underpinned it where some of the bike industry companies were beginning to struggle, because as we know, the industry kind of went into choppy, difficult times at the end of the 80s. Yeah. So, it was brands like Vision, and another brand we'll be talking about is Airwalk. Yeah. Which has a fantastic story. And actually I was only talking to Mark Luman this morning about Airwalk, and he blew my mind with what he knew and what he remembers and how closely connected to it he was.
And you look at both those teams, like the Vision Streetwear team and the Airwalk team, and that is like the coolest dudes of the coolest dudes at that time rode for them.
It was the rockstar teams, isn't it? I mean, look at Airwalk with, Brian Blyther was
Pete Augustin,
Craig Campbell,
Hoffman.
Yeah, all of those guys. You name a great rider of that era, they probably were on Airwalk. Yeah. And the same with Vision too. I mean, Vision, Eddie Roman, although I think Eddie was also on Airwalk at some point.
Yeah, I think there were crossover guys, but like Fuzzy Hall.
Yeah, Fuzzy.
Moeller
was Vision.
Yeah, I mean, it's like they just had everybody.
So again, they came in at a time and did their toe in the water. They jumped in both feet.
I mean, Vision did full BMX videos.
Exactly.
So.
They came along and became, I guess, you look at companies like Swatch as well. Yeah. These companies came into BMX or freestyle and really put their foot down as the first kind of extreme sports companies to venture into it, I think. Yeah. I mean, you could probably argue that with some of the other brands, but, so my plan was to look at brands in the later end of the decade. The only exceptions I've made to that are the other two companies we're going to talk about are Odyssey. Now, Odyssey, as we know, are a leading brand in modern BMX.
Yeah, they've been around since '85.
They came along in '85. There's a good story there. There's some great leads on their Vine to the Gyro, Brian Skura, a history of innovation. Yeah, Odyssey is a brand that can stand proudly in modern BMX.
Yeah, and then like any company, they've had their bumps in the roads through the years and everything. But I mean, yeah, definitely, Odyssey was just a parts company, and the Gyro kind of pushed them to the forefront.
Exactly, and they became a supporter of the scene. I mean, you don't have to look at too many videos before you see an Odyssey banner.
Oh yeah.
And they sponsored riders.
And out of all those early parts companies, if you're comparing it to ACS, Tioga, I mean, so many of them pulled away or died, or they're still at the forefront.
Odyssey have done well, haven't they? I mean, look at them now. Still a leading innovative company. So we'll be talking about them and talking to some of the people that were connected to them, including Brian. And also Redline. And this is quite an interesting one because I guess it's the exception to the rule I've just put down, which is we were looking for companies that were prevalent in the second half of the decade. But I was so kind of caught up in the Redline story myself, talking to RL on the first project. Again, another example of, as I said earlier, someone that I was talking to about, you know, the kind of corner of their story.
Yeah.
So I spoke to RL recently, and I said, "Listen, you know, I'd love to tell the Redline story. You know, you were there, you were the guy." And of course, Todd Anderson rode Redline. I have a connection to Lynn.
Yeah.
And some of the early racers too, guys like David Clinton. He's going to be helping us to kind of peg the story together at the back end. So we're going to talk about Redline too, and I think largely that's going to be through RL. So that's quite exciting because you know he's not somebody that's been particularly visible in the scene.
I mean,
a number of years.
I don't think. I mean, for the most part, you haven't seen anything of RL since Bully crashed.
Yeah.
You know, like 91.
So he's confident in working with us, and of course I think sort of managed to develop an honest relationship with him on the first book. Certainly really enjoyed talking to him and listened to the audio from that interview the other day, and remembered how many cool things I learned that day. So we're going to hear more from RL, which is exciting too. So there is this huge new group of contributors coming in. So I guess the headlines for anyone that's interested in supporting the project and pre-ordering the book is it's going to be a lot bigger.
Yeah.
It's going to be 310 pages. And there's going to be a bunch of great new content in it. There's going to be another 30...
So what do we got for content? We've got Dirt Bros chapter, NorCal / Curb Dogs chapter.
Yeah.
New industries chapters.
New brand chapters, updates to all chapters, introductions to all chapters, and also...
And little stories here and there, like more with Jeff Watson, kind of.
Yeah.
I'm sure there's going to be some other stuff.
Evolution of a lot of chapters, yeah.
Yeah.
And again, what I've tried to do, the reason the book is big is because I've tried to just allow space this time to be a little bit more indulgent, but not overindulgent.
Yeah.
And again, living by the rule that, you know, I don't just decide if it's an essential chapter. I talk to other people. So I talk to guys like, you know, Mark Luman and Andy, and I speak to other writers and people that were there, and I say, listen, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? Is this something that belongs in the book? So I tend to take a lot of advice like that as well, just so it's not me, you know, sitting in my little office in Oregon, making it all up. I don't get to choose the history. I just like to be the guy that tells it.
Yeah.
So I think it'll be an authentic piece of history again, and a step on with a bunch of new stuff that people are interested in.
So we went kind of over all the stuff that's going into it, you know, the new stuff. You know, we did this with the last one. I know, like, the last one you could just buy the book outright. There's like packages and certain awesome little things. You showed me some stuff last night.
Yeah.
I was like, I think I was way too excited about ceramic pins last night, but yeah, you want to give kind of a breakdown of like what are, because you can go. By the time this goes up, it'll be available for pre-order. Yeah. But yeah, what are kind of the packages you can get?
Well, firstly, the idea behind the packages, there's no science really. It's about helping to drive a little bit of seed funding into the project.
Yeah.
Because there's such an enormous amount of work involved, and also there's a lot of travel, and you know, unfortunately, I'm not wealthy enough to independently, you know, create projects like this. So what I do is I speak to the brands that I want to cover, and often they very quickly understand that, you know, we're going to produce some content, and I'm very realistic about what I need from them. Rarely I ask for money. What I normally do is I say to them, you know, let's produce something that excites our audience. So it's usually an item. So it's, you know, in the case of Vans, it was a pair of shoes that were designed with magazine art in the first project. And we create some T-shirts and stuff. And what happens is, you know, people get way more excited about that than they do about just reading about the chapter. So the two things kind of link together. So in this case, I've done the same thing again. I've pulled together products from companies that are supporting the project. I've asked them to produce something of quality and that is, you know, centric to the project. So, has some kind of design element to it that links it to the project as opposed to just being a different colour. So we have something coming from Vision, from Airwalk. We don't have shoes on this project, but we have some really cool soft goods coming in. There's something coming from Odyssey. We haven't quite decided on that yet, but I'm quite excited about what the two options are with that, and we'll know more about that coming up. We have a bunch of really cool little items like some, as you said earlier, ceramic pins.
Like what were they? Was it a 2-hip pin?
So 2-hip and pipeline. And there'll also be some patches too, some 2-hip and pipeline patches. Again, we get excited about that stuff, don't we?
Yeah. I'm a nerd.
So I put some packages together again, and I have made them what I believe to be pretty amazing value for money. I'm never about trying to make these things hugely profitable. I'm more about solving a problem, which is, if there's a bunch of guys out there that are excited by getting some, some authentic, cool items that we've made. So another thing that'll be in there is like a print of the cover, which will have Brian Blythe on it. So, it's really just an opportunity, I think, a fun way of getting people to engage. And the guys that want it, great, come in and get it. And, you'll get a bunch of stuff for a very, very good value.
And like I said, once you guys are hearing this,
you'll know
you'll be able to go to the website. I'm sure there's going to be a link or whatever.
Yeah, we're going to do a couple of hundred packages again. And I can tell you now there'll be 3, potentially 4 T-shirts in there. There'll be ceramic pins. There'll be some reissues of the 2-hip Society magazines. There'll be a little supplement that comes with the book that is rammed full of old AFA and 2-hip adverts.
Yep.
There will be an art print, like I said. God, there's a bunch of other things. I can't even remember, to be honest. I just know, looking at it, I think we looked at it last night, there'll obviously be a copy of the book.
Yeah.
And there'll be a wrap on those 200 books, too, that will be exclusive to the package. So again, for the people that want it, it's going to be there. And hopefully, people understand, I think, that it's a good mechanism to get a piece of history put together and out into the world. So.
Is there anything we're missing to touch on, do you think?
I don't think so, no. I think that's pretty much it, isn't it? We certainly covered stuff I think is important.
Yeah, I was just excited to kind of just touch back on this. Like, I said at the beginning of the pod, like, I'm always excited for any little piece of BMX history to come out and have something that you can put in your hands, and I feel as in BMX we need more of that, it'd be nice if more people did this, stepped in and did some stories from the 90s, or just photographers that were out there, did books of their own. And
well, the thing that I would say is I'm confident that there's a ton of assets out there that should be seen.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm trying to do that. And there's a bunch of stories out there that should be told, because I think, going back to what we said earlier, we might be talking about a period of 10 years here, but that's a busy 10 years.
Yeah, and it only gets busier as BMX goes on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Like as it goes on, it just gets busier and busier. Well, hey, let's plug the website just in case somebody's just listening to this in the car and they don't have it on their computer. What's the website?
So I'm just retooling it this week. It'll be ready by the time this comes out. So it's W freestylehistory.com.
Okay.
There should be a first edition page, a second edition page, so you can read all about the first project, see some cool pictures, and then. And
if somebody's really antsy, are there a few books left from the first edition?
There's some first editions left too. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Again, I'm not highly motivated to sell everything out.
Yeah.
Kind of feel a bit protective of some of those books.
Yeah.
Wanting to keep some, but definitely there's some still available. Yeah. And if people want to buy both, then great. But you can pre-order the book at that website, www.freestylehistory.com. We intend to drop the book in and the packages in December.
Oh, that's coming up.
So not too far out. And also, we're planning an event, actually. In fact, we're planning.
Yeah, actually, we talked about it. So hopefully, I don't know. We do shit. Yeah, hopefully, we'll have something fun going on. So.
Yeah, something fun and unique.
Yeah. So.
And cool. Yeah.
All right. Well, I guess that's it. Thank you for talking to me again. I appreciate it, and
thanks for having me, man.
Yeah. Until next time, guys. Thanks for listening.